September 15th, 1940. 22. Fighter Command Operations Room, Bentley Priory. A cold, low-ceilinged room lit by banks of lamps and the ghostly filaments of map tables. The air tastes of boiled tea and stale tobacco. The walls hum with the tired heartbeat of electric fans. Men in greatcoats, wing commanders and plotters, sergeants with the lines of stress carved into their faces, move like cogs around a great table that is itself a machine. Pins, strings, and counters, tracking squadrons, altitudes, headings. Outside, London is a distant furnace of light. The sky is a bruise. The H-hour for another wave of German bombers is approaching, and every eye in the room is fixed on the instruments that can turn that bruise into numbers and numbers into action. On the far wall, a bank of radio operators bend toward their headphones, voices low and tense, reciting bearings and estimated ranges. A signalman taps out Morse from a teleprinter. Its clack cuts the low murmur like a staccato heartbeat. Far left, a penciled map of the East Coast is pinned with tiny flags, the chain home stations, each one an unloved sentinel of steel masts and wires standing against an indifferent sea. They look, to any casual observer, like a patchwork of obsolete poles. The term radio masts is muttered with a hint of scorn by those who remember earlier arguments. What good are poles in the air? Some had asked in the years before this machine proved itself. You are there in the room, pressed against the map board, breath fogging in the cold air. A sergeant in an RAF greatcoat points at a series of pale green blips on a plotting table. Plotted returns from the coast, and murmurs the name that has, for weeks now, been whispered like a talisman. Chain home. You run your finger along the string that links a distant return to the little model aircraft token on the table. The string tightens, and a fighter squadron token begins to slide. Behind the map, an officer in a peaked cap, staff, lean hairline scar at his temple, speaks into a telephone. His voice is clipped, military. Scramble all Spitfires from Biggin Hill. Intercept vector, line astern of the convoy. The plotters move with machine precision, converting blips into vectors into orders. Somewhere deep in the room, a sergeant is refitting a tired pair of headphones. The tapping of the teletype accelerates. The tension is mechanical and human at once, levers, lungs, and nerves. But the machines on which they now rely were once a joke. Robert Watson Watt's name is not on the ceiling here, but his work is in every ragged breath. 10 years earlier, in laboratories smelling of oil and chalk dust, a small group of scientists had produced a strange and unwelcome idea that radio waves, when bounced off a metallic object, would return with a telltale signature. It was a theory that read like magic to the layman and like quackery to many in power. Governments, military men, and editors had laughed or shrugged at the notion. The very equipment that now muttered warnings in this room had once been dismissed as futuristic nonsense by people who could not imagine an invisible net that could see at night. Robert Watson Watt himself, brusque, always a little too impatient for the polite forms of scientific diplomacy, had felt the ridicule keenly. He was not an aristocrat of science. He was a radio man, a practical experimenter, the kind of person who preferred wires and spark gaps to speeches and title pages. When he wrote the memorandum that would eventually carry his name into the arsenal of the nation, a paper that argued, in plain, stubborn language, that radio echoes could be turned into warnings, many asked for proof. The proof, when it came, arrived like a small, stubborn miracle at Daventry. A pulse returned, a blip appeared where none had been before, and a whisper of possibility moved through the corridors where policy and funding were decided. Those early demonstrations were messy. The apparatus was crude. Spark transmitters, receivers, and a patchwork of valve amplifiers, all jammed into a hut or a shed. Watson Watt's assistant, a young mathematician named Arnold Wilkins, became the patient hand to the scientist's impatient mind, calculating, refining, and arguing until the theory became repeatable. There were nights of cold tea and failed oscillators, afternoons of conferences in which Watson Watt would be pressed by skeptical men who could not imagine engines and wires deciding the outcome of a battle over the sky. Radio? To detect aircraft. Preposterous, a few had scoffed. You cannot see with electricity, quipped one official, and the jibe cut deeper than it should have. But the experiment kept returning one stubborn fact. Metal in the sky returned a signal. The bureaucrats, ever cautious, offered funding only grudgingly. The scientific establishment, wrapped in its own hierarchies, offered polite disclaimers. Yet those huts on the fringe, those awkward nights in the wind, produced the skeleton of what would become Chain Home. Long coastal masts, transmitter houses, and the system of operators and plotters that now chain London to the coast like a safety line. By late 1939 and into 1940, as the war moved from the map into the air, the skeptic's laughter had been replaced by a nervous curiosity. There were still politicians who fretted over expense, still commanders who preferred numbers on paper to glowing arcs on a cathode. But now, on nights like this, the glow of cathode ray tubes and the crackle of receivers were not curiosities. They were the nation's eyes. The Chain Home network, crude by later standards, detected formations of German bombers approaching across the North Sea. It did not tell the pilots where to aim their guns, but it gave the controllers in rooms like this one time. Time to wake sleeping squadrons, time to vector Spitfires into the path of destroying night raids, time to lay the thread of human coordination across a cold and hungry sky. You can almost hear, beneath the professional calm, the echo of the earlier mockery. Men in suits had once said the system would never work at range, that ground echoes would drown the returns, that the math would not match the sky. Yet here the math matches, in the low light, to the click of teletype and the rustle of maps. The very men who had once been amused by the suggestion of radio detection now stand by its outputs as if by miracle. Outside, the night is feathered with searchlight beams and the distant roar of bomber engines. Down in London, businesses are closed, but their furnaces remain hot, chimneys breathing steam into the dark. Air raid sirens will sound in an hour, or perhaps already have. But here, in the operations room, a breath is exhaled, and then held as a string of markers inches along the plotting board. The telephone rings again. Orders are given, voices clipped to imperceptible edges. The Chain Home blips, the product of Watson Watt's stubborn insistence that radio could be made to see, are translated into trajectories. Pilots at Biggin Hill, at Hornchurch, at Northolt would soon be rising into the cold North Sea night, engines choking on high octane, ready to run toward those echoes of steel and canvas. Robert Watson Watt, decades older but still restless in the mind, was not here in person tonight. He had been called to the corridors of power during the critical years, summoned before committees, tasked with turning laboratory oddities into a nationwide network. He had been derided and then entrusted, had been forced to translate technical stubbornness into plans and masts and men. But the essence of his invention, the simple, uncompromising idea that radio waves could be used as a probe into the night, now sits at the core of this room's order. It is an idea that some had once said would never work. Tonight, those words are drowned out by the teletype and the first faint, mechanical clarity of a nation's new sight. February 26, 1935. Daventry, England. A pale winter sun glows weakly through a film of mist as a group of engineers stand shivering in a muddy field. A lorry has been parked at the edge of a hedgerow, its tarpaulin peeled back to reveal a tangle of cables, valves, and a single, ungainly antenna. The ground crunches underfoot with frost. Steam curls from the mouths of men who would one day be written into footnotes of history. At the center of them all stands Robert Watson Watt. Overcoat collar raised, notebook tucked under one arm, jaw clenched against both the wind and the skepticism surrounding him. Across the field, nearly 5 miles away, an RAF Hayford bomber is preparing to lift off. The pilot checks his watch, 9:15 a.m., as he pulls on his leather gloves. His orders are simple. Fly a straight course over the radio beam between the BBC shortwave transmitter at Daventry and a listening post hastily set up in this very field. No one expects much to happen. Some have bet pints that the entire affair will end with nothing more than static and embarrassment. Watson Watt's assistant, Arnold Wilkins, crouches beside the receiver set. He's 30, bespectacled, and quietly brilliant. The kind of man who solves problems without announcing it. He checks the dials, adjusts the frequency, and gives a small nod. The receiver hums faintly. The cathode ray tube flickers to life. The others, a mixture of Air Ministry officials and radio technicians, exchange uneasy glances. Then it happens. A low droning grows louder, the sound of the Hayford bomber cutting through the mist. Wilkins leans closer to the screen. The green trace on the oscilloscope jumps. Once, twice, then surges with a steady pulse. The beam is reflecting back. The aircraft, invisible to the naked eye, is there, caught by the echo of invisible waves. Watson Watt straightens, eyes fixed on the trembling light. For a long moment, no one speaks. Then, quietly but firmly, he says, "Gentlemen, there it is. The WWII." The demonstration lasts only minutes, but its impact will echo for decades. By noon, the results are in black ink in his notebook, proof that radio waves can detect aircraft miles away. The skeptical officers, their boots caked with mud, their breath visible in the chill air, now see something they cannot unsee. The world has just changed, though few yet realize it. Within days, Watson Watt is summoned to the Air Ministry in London. The corridors smell of pipe smoke and bureaucracy. Men in pinstriped suits sit behind mahogany desks, shuffling papers and asking cautious questions. "You're certain of your results?" one asks, pencil tapping on a notepad. Watson Watt answers, as always, with practicality over polish. "I'm not interested in theory," he says, voice edged with Scottish directness. "We have observed it. It works. What remains is to make it useful." Useful. That single word becomes the cornerstone of his crusade. The Air Ministry, still smarting from fears of an unstoppable bomber force, agrees to fund a trial, $10,000 for what they call radio direction finding. The name radar has yet to exist. What follows is a frantic race against both time and disbelief. By the summer of 1935, a barren stretch of coastline in Suffolk becomes the unlikely cradle of Britain's future defence. Bawdsey Manor, a windswept estate overlooking the North Sea, is converted into an experimental station. The manor's rooms, once filled with the laughter of aristocrats, now echo with the whine of transmitters and the clang of soldering irons. Watson Watt leads a small, eccentric army of scientists, engineers, and military officers. Among them, Edward Bowen, a Welsh physicist who arrives with a talent for improvisation and a habit of muttering equations under his breath. Wilkins remains his steady right hand, translating Watson Watt's bursts of vision into mathematics and circuit diagrams. The early systems are primitive. Towers of wood and wire rise like skeletal giants over the coast. Transmitters hum, receivers hiss, and the entire contraption looks to any outsider like a farmer's failed attempt to catch lightning. The signals are messy, the echoes faint. Ground clutter, reflections from the earth and sea, make readings nearly impossible to interpret. But slowly, painfully, the team learns to separate the noise from the truth. When a flight of RAF bombers passes offshore, the oscilloscopes dance with rhythmic pulses. Distances are measured, bearings calculated, and for the first time they begin to track movement, real movement, through air alone. At night, the Manor's halls glow with lamplight as Wilkins and Bowen hunch over blueprints. Watson Watt paces the floor above, muttering calculations and chain-smoking cigarettes. "We are building a mirror for the sky," he says to anyone who will listen. "And one day, gentlemen, that mirror will save us all." Yet even as progress mounts, ridicule lingers. Reports circulate within the government. One Air Council member famously calls the entire project an engineer's fantasy. Newspapers joke about electric eyes watching the clouds. Funds nearly dry up twice. Watson Watt, ever impatient with red tape, storms through offices and committee rooms demanding more resources, more time, more understanding. At one point, frustrated by a particularly dismissive senior officer, he writes a scathing letter to a colleague. They ask for miracles, then mock the machinery that might perform them. Let them mock. The air will prove us right. By 1938, the results are undeniable. A chain of prototype stations now stretches along the eastern coast. Crude skeletal towers capable of detecting aircraft over 100 miles away. The network earns a new name: Chain Home. The system is far from perfect. Blind at low altitudes, dependent on human interpretation. But it is revolutionary. For the first time in human history, a nation can sense an approaching enemy before that enemy is even visible. And in September 1938, as Hitler's armies march into Czechoslovakia and Europe trembles at the brink, Watson Watt and his team work through the night, expanding, calibrating, perfecting. They know, though they never say it aloud, that war is coming. Standing beneath the roaring masts at Bawdsey one evening, Watson Watt stares toward the horizon. The sun sinks into the North Sea, the air cold with salt. Beside him, Wilkins says quietly, "Do you think they'll believe us now?" Watson Watt lights another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his lined face. "They'll believe us," he says, exhaling smoke into the dusk. When they have no choice. August 1939. Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk coast. The air is thick with salt and the hum of generators. Inside the makeshift control hut, half laboratory, half barracks, a group of operators crowd around the glowing green faces of cathode ray tubes. The faint buzz of transformers blends with the rhythmic pulse of a signal that seems almost alive. It's nearing dusk, and outside, the sea glints dull silver under a low gray sky. Watson Watt stands in the doorway, his coat thrown over one arm, sleeves rolled up, his shirt stained with grease and tobacco ash. His hair is unkempt, his expression caught between exhaustion and exhilaration. On the screen, a faint pulse wavers, the echo of an aircraft 30 miles away, invisible but unmistakably there. "Gentlemen," he says softly, "that's your enemy, long before he knows he's been seen." Behind him, Edward Bowen grins, and she's steady as a heartbeat now. They've done it. After years of ridicule and improvisation, the world's first operational radar network stands ready. Each station, tall steel masts stretching hundreds of feet into the air, watches a section of the British coast. They're crude but functional, their range reaching far into the North Sea. The chain home system is alive. When war breaks out a week later, on September 1st, 1939, Britain's defenses are untested. In London, gas masks are issued. Children are evacuated. Newspapers fill with speculation about air raids and poison gas. But in the narrow band of coast between the Thames and the Firth of Forth, a quiet network hums into action. From the outside, these radar stations look unimpressive, more like radio relay farms than the backbone of national defense. But inside, the operators, often women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, sit with headsets and pencils poised, watching the green lines flicker across their screens. Every echo, every anomaly is logged, plotted, and sent by telephone to the filter room at Fighter Command. At Bentley Priory, near London, a vast map stretches across a table the size of a tennis court. Small blocks, color-coded by squadron, are pushed along tracks by long wooden rods. Each block represents a group of fighters, each movement guided by the unseen eyes of radar. This integration, science feeding strategy, is Watt's true genius. Radar alone could only see, but combined with radio, telephony, and command structure, it becomes something greater, an information weapon. Now, Britain does not have to wait for enemy bombers to appear over the channel. It can meet them there. In the months that follow, the system grows. New towers rise in Norfolk, Lincolnshire, and Scotland. Transmitters are recalibrated, frequencies refined. Engineers work through rain and blackout nights, guided by dim lamps and cigarettes clenched between their teeth. The sound of hammering and the smell of wet concrete mix with the constant wind. Meanwhile, Watt moves between Bawdsey and London, briefing officers and ministers, translating the language of science into the vocabulary of war. He is not a natural politician, too impatient, too blunt, but he commands respect. He argues that radar is not merely a device, but a doctrine: detection, interception, control. At a high-level meeting in early 1940, a senior air marshal asks whether the system will work in a real war. Watt replies, dry, nearly defiant. "It already is, sir. The war simply hasn't caught up to it yet." That war catches up in May 1940. France collapses under the German Blitzkrieg. The British Expeditionary Force retreats toward Dunkirk. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe bombers range freely over Europe. Britain braces for invasion. By June, with France fallen, the Luftwaffe turns its eyes to Britain. Hitler's plan, Operation Sea Lion, requires control of the skies. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. And for the first time, the chain home network will face the test for which it was built. July 1940. A dawn haze rolls in off the sea near Dover. At the chain home station atop Swingate Downs, WAAF operator Margaret Horton sits before a green cathode screen. Her pencil hovers over a plotting chart. Suddenly, a faint spike flares on the scope. A cluster of echoes moving fast, closing from the east. She adjusts her dial, checks the timing, and shouts over her shoulder, "Plot confirmed. 40, maybe 50 contacts, range 70 miles, heading west." Within minutes, the report is relayed to Bentley Priory. Telephones ring, controllers snap to attention. The data flows like electricity. Radar to filter room to group headquarters, group HQ to the squadrons, Biggin Hill, Tangmere, Northolt, RAF airfields that will become legend. Pilots race to their Hurricanes and Spitfires, engines coughing into life. Orders come through the crackling headset. Bandits approaching Dover, Angels 15, Vector 090. The chain home's invisible reach has just given them 10 precious minutes. Time to climb, to form up, to fight on their own terms. In those 10 minutes, lives are saved, and Britain's fate tilts ever so slightly toward survival. Day after day, week after week, the pattern repeats. Radar detects, controllers vector, pilots engage. The system functions like a living organism, a nervous system stretched across an island under siege. Watt, now overseeing the operational expansion from London, follows the reports with a mixture of pride and dread. His invention is no longer theoretical. It is killing and saving men every day. He often refuses interviews and keeps his name from publicity. To him, this is not about fame, but function. Still, he cannot help but remember the laughter, the memos dismissing his work as fantasy. He imagines those same doubters now, huddled in air raid shelters, listening to the rumble of distant anti-aircraft fire, and surviving because of the very system they once mocked. By September 1940, as the Luftwaffe shifts to bombing London, the chain-home network is battle-hardened. Its operators have learned to distinguish between bombers and fighters, between decoys and diversions. Its integration with the Royal Observer Corps forms a net so tight that few enemy planes cross unspotted. Britain's coastline, once blind, now sees in every direction. And in a nation weary from nights of sirens and firestorms, the phrase "radar has them" becomes a quiet reassurance, whispered in control rooms, air bases, and shelters alike. Robert Watson Watt's invisible invention has turned into an armor of airwaves, one that even the enemy cannot understand. September 15th, 1940. Dawn. The Battle of Britain reaches its crescendo. Across southern England, the skies roar metal and smoke. The hum of hundreds of engines gathers like an oncoming storm. From the cliffs of Dover to the fields of Kent, the air itself seems alive with movement. Down in the operations rooms, the flickering lights of radar screens pulse with data faster than operators can write. Each echo is a warning. Each return is a life hanging in the balance. At 11 hours in the underground operations room at Fighter Command headquarters, the tension is suffocating. A WAAF plotter slides a small red marker westward across the channel. "Raid approaching from Calais, sir. Strength over 200 aircraft." Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, calm but pale, leans over the table. "Confirm the sector." "Crossing at Dover in 10 minutes. Height 15,000. Dowding nods once. "Scramble them all." From Hornchurch, Northolt, Biggin Hill, across all of 11 groups' airfields, pilots run for their planes. Tires screech on tarmac. Merlin engines roar to life. Dust and grass whip into the air as propellers bite. In the cockpit of a Spitfire climbing through the haze, a young pilot glances at the sky and mutters to himself, "They'll never catch us sleeping." He doesn't know it, but that confidence, that readiness, is born of radar. Without it, he would have been sitting in the mess hall, unaware that 200 German bombers were already bearing down on him. At Swingate and Rye, the chain home stations hum relentlessly. Inside one concrete blockhouse, operator Lillian Moss steadies her trembling hand as the blip on her scope blooms and splits, a massive aircraft now breaking formation. She calls out, voice sharp with adrenaline, "Multiple contacts, splitting to north and south, estimated altitude now 20,000. Her report is relayed to the filter room in seconds. Controllers shout bearings and altitudes into telephones, hands darting across maps, sweat glistening under fluorescent light. The air smells of paper, dust, and cigarettes. To the untrained eye, it's chaos. Colored blocks sliding, chalk lines changing, call signs repeated over the din. But underneath, it's precision. Every movement calculated, every order tied to a pulse on a cathode screen hundreds of miles away. This is Watson Watt's invisible network in action. Science translated into strategy at the speed of thought. Meanwhile, over the channel, the Luftwaffe is flying blind. German intelligence had long been aware of the tall masts along Britain's coast, but dismissed them as simple radio towers. Luftwaffe crews had even strafed them early in the campaign, unaware of their true purpose. Their damage reports spoke of minor communication disruption, never realizing they were attacking the eyes of their enemy and failing to blind them. By late summer, German pilots began to notice something strange. No matter when or where they approached, the RAF always seemed to be waiting. Squadrons appeared in perfect time, not too early, not too late, as if guided by an unseen hand. The English always know, one bomber commander complained. It is as though they can see us coming. They could. At 12:15 p.m., the first wave of bombers crosses the coast. Over London, anti-aircraft batteries open fire, painting the sky with black puffs of smoke. Searchlights stab upward through the haze. In the air, Spitfires and Hurricanes dive through formations of Heinkels and Dorniers, tearing into their ranks. Engines scream, shells burst, parachutes bloom like pale flowers against the grey. In the control room, the plotting table looks almost alive. Red markers pushing inland, blue markers rising to meet them, yellow tags noting new sightings. Every movement is radioed to and from the front. The voices are calm but fast, clipped with discipline and fear. 12 group to command. Intercept complete. 15 bandits destroyed. Request vector adjustment. Fuel low. Dowding watches in silence, his hand resting on the table's edge. The system, his pilots, his squadrons, and above all, the radar chain that ties them together, is working flawlessly. At Bawdsey, Watson Watt listens to updates from a crackling radio. He's no longer at the consoles or the towers. Now, he's a civilian advisor, a man whose creation has grown beyond his control. But as he hears reports of successful interceptions, his jaw sets in quiet pride. He remembers the words that haunted him in 1935. It will never work. He can almost hear them now, drowned beneath the roar of victory in the air. A junior officer bursts in, waving a report. Enemy losses today are catastrophic. Our intercept rate, unprecedented. Watson Watt says nothing at first. He looks out the window toward the grey horizon, toward the sea where it all began. Finally, he exhales. Then let them write that down, he says quietly. Let them write that radar turned the tide. By evening, the battle is over. The Luftwaffe has lost more than twice the number of aircraft the RAF has. The German invasion, Operation Sea Lion, is quietly shelved. Britain, battered but unbroken, still stands. In the following days, newspapers hail the few, the pilots who fought in the skies. But behind those headlines, buried deep in the fine print, is a single paragraph mentioning early warning devices that aided the RAF's success. The name radar is not used. It remains classified. The public will never know that an invisible web of radio waves, conceived in ridicule, has just saved their island from invasion. Watson Watt doesn't mind the omission. Fame, to him, is irrelevant. What matters is that the system worked, that the invention no one believed in has bought the world another chance. He walks alone along the dark coast one night, past the humming masts of Chain Home. The wind howls through the steel structures, wires singing like faint music. Somewhere above, searchlights still sweep the clouds. He stops, hands in the pockets, and looks up. Eyes in the sky, he murmurs, echoing his words from years before. They laughed, but the sky sees us now. The wind swallows his voice, but the towers hum their reply. A language of pulse and echo, of warning and salvation. Spring, 1945, London. The war is nearly over. The streets are lined with rubble and victory posters, the air still carrying the smell of coal smoke and dust. In a quiet office at the Air Ministry, Robert Watson Watt sits behind a desk piled high with reports and technical drawings. His hair has gone grey at the edges. The lines around his eyes are deeper now, carved by years of strain and sleepless nights. On the wall behind him hangs a photograph of the Chain Home towers, the skeletal sentinels that changed the course of a nation's fate. A young officer enters, salutes, and places a document on the desk. It's stamped top secret. Radar Development Directorate. Watson Watt signs it without looking. The war has turned his creation into an empire of technology. From ground radar to shipborne systems, from night fighter interceptors to submarine detection. What began as a radio eye in a muddy field has evolved into a vast network spanning continents. He leans back, cigarette smoldering between his fingers, and lets his mind wander back to Daventry, to the frost and the hum of that first crude receiver. He can still see the blip on the screen, trembling like a heartbeat in the static, proof that the unseen could be made visible. He smiles faintly. "They said it would never work," he murmurs, "but it worked. And it saved us all." In the months after the war, the truth begins to emerge. Newspapers and documentaries finally tell the story of the secret technology that gave Britain its edge. Radar, they call it now, a new word for a new kind of warfare. Journalists clamor to interview Watson Watt, but he avoids the spotlight. He prefers the company of engineers to reporters, the hum of transmitters to applause. Yet, slowly, the world begins to understand the scale of what he and his small team achieved. The phrase, "eyes in the sky," becomes literal. An invisible shield that not only guarded Britain, but transformed the way humanity fights and survives. In Parliament, leaders speak of radar as the invention that won the Battle of Britain. Historians echo the sentiment, but for Watson Watt, the pride is bittersweet. He knows radar was never a single man's triumph. It was the work of many hands, from Wilkins and Bowen to the anonymous WAAF operators who turned signals into salvation. He often says, when asked about credit, "It was not I who saw the enemy first. It was a girl at a scope in a hut by the sea." By the 1950s, radar has become the backbone of modern defense. From civil aviation to weather forecasting, the technology born from his experiments now touches every aspect of life. Aircraft cross oceans guided by invisible signals. Ships find harbor through fog. Storms are tracked long before they reach land. Yet the man who made it possible fades quietly from public view. He leaves government service, lectures occasionally, and writes modestly about his experiences. Fame, when it comes, feels almost accidental, a side effect of history remembering its heroes. In one rare interview, a journalist asks him what it felt like to have changed the world. Watson Watt chuckles, the sound dry and self-effacing. "We were simply doing our jobs," he says. "We were trying to make sure there'd still be a world to change." Years later, in 1966, he receives a knighthood for his contributions to science and defense. The ceremony is formal, dignified, full of polished medals and quiet applause. But when the Queen pins the insignia to his chest, Watson Watt's expression is distant, as though his mind is elsewhere, perhaps back in that field in Daventry where the idea first sparked to life. He accepts the honor humbly, saying only, "It is nice to be remembered before one becomes history." As the decades pass, radar evolves beyond anything he could have imagined. Satellites now peer down through clouds. Computers read signals faster than any human could. The same principles of reflection and return, once dismissed as nonsense, guide spacecraft, detect asteroids, and map distant planets. Every time a pilot crosses a storm safely, every time a ship navigates by radar in the dark, every time a meteorologist warns of a hurricane, the echo of Watson Watt's idea lives on. The same simple truth he proved in that muddy field, that the unseen can be made visible if you dare to listen for it. Autumn, 1973. Inverness, Scotland. The air is cold and clean, the sky vast and grey. Sir Robert Watson Watt, now an old man, sits on a bench overlooking the water. His hands tremble slightly as he turns the pages of a newspaper. Inside is a story about new radar satellites orbiting the Earth, capable of mapping entire continents. He chuckles softly and folds the paper. Beside him, a curious child asks, "Did you really make the machine that could see airplanes?" He looks down at the boy, eyes bright behind thick glasses. "Not see," he says. "Listen. We listened to the sky, and it told us where danger lived." The child nods, though he doesn't fully understand. Watson Watt smiles faintly, gazing out at the horizon one last time. The wind carries the sound of distant aircraft, a faint hum, barely audible. To him it is the sound of proof, of persistence, of everything that once seemed impossible. He closes his eyes and lets the sound fade into memory. They said his invention would never work. They laughed at the idea that radio waves could guard a nation. But when the bombs fell and the sky turned red, his invisible network held firm. And in that holding, in those unseen echoes stretching over the sea, Britain found not just defense, but hope. Because Robert Watson Watt gave the island something no enemy could destroy: eyes in the sky.